So we're in part 1, Roman numeral 2 in your notes. We're going to talk about canonical models here. And we're going to begin with the first of the canonical models. And there's really 3 canonical models, or I should say 3 categories. We're going to talk about canon as what we're going to call community determined. This is going to be the first category, and there's a bunch of examples of this. Then there's going to be canon as historically determined. And then we're going to talk about, thirdly, the self-authenticating model. And then those of you who've had me in class before, you always know the last view is always the right view, in case you haven't figured that out yet. So we'll be talking about community determined, historically determined, and then our self-authenticating model. Now, all joking aside, what we're going to try to do in the self-authenticating model is actually draw upon the strengths of these prior two and try to avoid the weaknesses of them. But we're going to start first with the way these folks authenticate canon. Then we're going to talk about the way these folks authenticate canon. Then we'll talk about the way we authenticate canon. In other words, how we know, right? Do we have grounds for knowing? What mechanism allows a person to know? Now, before we jump into the community determined model, just a few broad comments about canonical models in general. You can see this as point A. This whole concept of a canonical model is pretty new for maybe some of you. And what I was surprised at when I wrote this book is how rarely people talk about it. In fact, I had to basically create this scheme myself based on my own research. There was nobody out there that said, here's all the canonical models, and I tweaked it. There's nobody out there that was doing this. And I think that's a real unfortunate thing, and it's part of the reason I wrote the book, is that we need to talk about canonical models because that's the worldview through which you view canon. Okay, so just a few comments here about the importance of canonical models. When we talk about a canonical model, we're not talking about the conclusions that one comes to historically about canon. This is very important. So when someone says, my model is that the canon came around in the 4th century, and another person says, well, my model is that canon came around in the 2nd century, that's not what we're talking about in canonical models. Those are historical conclusions. What we want to know is what's the grid you use to get to those historical conclusions? What's the canonical system that led you there? Canonical models, then, are what you might really call canonical worldviews. Okay? They determine all kinds of things. They have impacts on maybe how you date the canon, but they really belong to the category of how you authenticate canon, how you know which books are in and which books are out. So everybody has to have a canonical model. Whether they know it or not, it's a separate question. Whether they can articulate it or not, it's another question. So it's important that you understand the concept of canonical model. Otherwise, you just end up talking past somebody. And you've seen this in conversations. We'll see examples of this in the world of canon, particularly when it comes to dating. Someone says, well, I'll show in a minute. Someone goes, well, look, the canon happened in the 2nd century. Another person says, well, the canon happened in the 4th century. You're like, well, you guys are missing each other here. Isn't historical evidence, doesn't everyone agree on that? What's going on with your interpretation of the historical evidence? You have to back up and say, well, what's your model for what counts as canon? How do you know a canon when you see it? What is a canon? Notice that those questions don't come from the historical evidence. You can't answer those questions just by looking at facts. You have to have some system of thinking theologically that tells you what a canon is so you can go out and find out when it exists. And so canonical models are actually very explanatory. They help show where the disagreement really lies. They also help show where it doesn't lie. What you might be interested to know is actually some people actually agree on a lot more than they realize. And the reason they're talking past each other is because they have a wholly different model they're using when they're coming to the stage to talk about these things. So canonical models are really important. The other thing to keep in mind about canonical models is what the main way we're going to categorize them by title. The titles of each of these models has to do with not the date of canon or anything like that, but rather the way books are authenticated, the way someone claims to know which books are in and which books are out. This is pretty rare. Most people, when they talk about canonical positions or canonical models, it's almost always based on date. So you got an early date, a middle date, and a late date or something like that. But this has got nothing to do with date. This has got to do with your method of authentication. Another qualification on a model here is that sometimes models overlap. And you just have to know that. When we talk about canon as community determined, there's certain aspects of this that are going to overlap with that. There's certain aspects of that are going to overlap with this. So Canonical models aren't neat and tidy, and the reason is because scholars who hold views don't hold views in a neat and tidy way. They mix and match and so forth. So it's very hard to categorize people into canonical models. All of that is simply to say that what we're going to lay out for you here is going to be very broad and general. And you have to have a sense that it can be qualified with exceptions all the time. So these aren't airtight categories between each of these three things as we go. All right, let's start first with then the community-determined model. I'm going to give a brief overview there, as you can see in your notes, and then we'll jump into instances of it. Remember, this is an umbrella category. Under this is 4 different versions of that. Before we get into those different types of community-determined models, though, let's talk about what we mean by community-determined models. For a community-determined approach to Canon, they basically will argue that Canon is sort of authenticated by, and you know which books belong to Canon when it's received by some sort of group of people or a community. What that means then, that Canon is something that is established by usage. Usage is what makes a book canonical. When it's used or received by either a community or individuals, that's what makes something a canon. What that means is that for a community-determined approach to canon, you don't have a canon until you have a community that treats a book a certain way. Canon, therefore, does not exist until there's a response or an acknowledgement from the community of that book or books being canonical. And here's the real kicker for the understanding of community-determined canon models. There's nothing about a book itself that makes it canonical. Canonicity as a concept, according to the community-determined model, is not an inherent attribute of a book. It's something that a book becomes when it is used by a community. So if you were to ask a community-determined model person which books are canonical, or how do you know which books are canonical, the answer is the books that are used by the community are the ones that are canonical. The community determines, through its own experience and usage, which books are from God. So there's no inherent quality or attribute about a book that makes it canonical according to this view. It's just the usage that is critical. What that means then is that for a community-determined model, canonicity is something imposed on books. It's an attribute given to books from the outside. And you can just off the cuff, you can just see what we mean by this. I mean, think about the Roman Catholic model. There's a lot of sense in which canon is something sort of attributed to books. And certainly in other examples of the community-determined models, this will be the case. Now, with that in mind then, let's walk through the different examples of canon as community-determined. And each of these examples, I'll give a description of it, we'll talk about its positives and negatives, and I'll give an assessment of it, and then we'll move on. One of the things you'll note about the community-determined models, this is another big picture observation here on the front end, is that this is definitively the biggest category of canon models today. Absolutely dominates. Second one, not near as big, and of course the third one, other than us, isn't around. Moreover, the other observation I want to make before we jump in further is you'll be surprised how different these 4 different examples are. You may not realize it, that both Bart Ehrman and Roman Catholics are both under the first heading. Now you might think, well, that's weird. How could Bart Ehrman and Roman Catholics be in the same canonical model? They have completely different conclusions about canon. One says 27 books, one says who knows. One says it's an early date, someone says not close, a late date. They're all over the map different. That tells you about what I mean by canonical models. Remember what I said a minute ago? Canonical models are not just the conclusions you reach historically, but the method that got you there. Okay? And what I want to show you is, even though Bart Ehrman and Roman Catholics end up in very different places, they have a remarkably similar method. Now, that should be a little bit shocking to you. And I'm actually going to push back against my Roman Catholic friends on this in a moment when we get to Roman Catholicism, because what I'm argue there is that they actually end up making the same arguments that Bart Ehrman does in order to prove their case. And I've actually said this in a bunch of online discussions with Roman Catholics, and I'll explain more what I mean by that when I get there. But the rather odd bedfellows that are under this first heading are illustrative of what we mean by canonical models. If it was as simple as historical conclusions, then we would be with the Roman Catholics, and Bart Ehrman would be on another position. But it's not as simple as just your historical conclusions, late date, early date, all 27, 24, 29. That's not the issue. The issue is how you know, your method of authentication. And all the people in this first category all authenticate books in the same way, and that is the community determines which books. Now, for those of you who are theologically minded, and I'm assuming this is everybody in this room, you already have alarm bells going off at this, right? The community determines which books are canon? How can that be? If the community determines which books are canon, does that mean the community is really the authority? Yeah, you're getting somewhere, right? Now you're thinking, I'm seeing my objections there. You're already sniffing it out. This is exactly where we're going to go, but let's just break it down into all its little subcategories. So let's start first with as you can see in your notes, the historical critical model. And this is the first example of community-determined model of canon. The historical critical model is the Bart Ehrman model, just if you want to make it real simple here. I don't say that in the book, but I can say it here. It is the model represented by the major universities filled with left-leaning liberal scholars committed to Enlightenment rationalism. What do scholars like that believe about the canon? They believe fundamentally that the canon is simply the result of human activity. It's just the actions of human beings, sometimes individually, sometimes collectively as a church, that through political maneuverings and other types of influence and intimidation created a collection of books. 27 of them, in fact, that we call the New Testament. So one of the things that marks the historical critical model is a tremendous amount of focus on the human nature of the canon, the human element in canon. The canon is just a product of human activity. Another way to say it is, if you were to ask a critical scholar, why do we have the canon we have? He'd answer, well, because humans got together and picked these books. And it's just the result of human pressures and human machinations and human political maneuvering. James Barr, who's a scholar kind of like Ehrman of sorts, he says it this way: the decision to collect a group of chosen books and form a scripture are all human decisions. Now, there's a word for this that scholars have begun to use, and you can see it there in your notes. This idea of taking the canon process and making it all about human activity and no divine activity at all, just what humans did in history, that is called the naturalization of canon. And you can see why that term is the term that we're using here, because it takes something that typically people associated historically with divine activity, God putting together His Word, and have stripped it down to just purely human activity. They naturalized it. So the historical critical model then is saying, look, canon is the result of human decisions, just normal human activity produced the canon. Now, once you say that, you get a whole list of suggestions of what human activity produced the canon. And I can't even begin to tell you how many different versions of this there are out there. What series of human circumstances produced the canon? Well, I'll give you a few examples here. You can see them in your notes. One of the most famous ones you've probably heard about is the idea that it was Marcion who created the idea of a canon. If you know anything about Marcion, he's sort of the church's first heretic. In the middle of the 2nd century, he went to Rome and started teaching that the God of the Old Testament wasn't the true God, that the God of the Old Testament was a false God, and the Old Testament should be stripped from the Bible. And then he also edited the New Testament and just said that only the Gospel of Luke and Paul's epistle should be redeemed Scripture. And he created his own canon. And he was condemned for being a heretic. Well, some scholars have said, well, it was Marcion's activity that kind of spurred the church on to create a canon. And if he hadn't done it, there wouldn't have probably ever been one. So why do we have a canon? Answer, Marcion. Others suggest other reasons. I'll give you a long list of here. Some say canon is just a way the church expresses its identity. All these books are is a human self-description. That's what religious texts are, right? Aren't religious texts just your own self-description of your own cultural identity as a religion? Isn't that what the Bible is? The Bible is just an expression of your own identity as believers, right? It's not, God's not involved. It's human self-expression. There's a lot of scholars that suggest that's what sort of gave rise to the canon. I mean, if you're a religion, don't you want to express yourself eventually, and you do it in text? This is the idea behind that. So it's another form of this naturalization theme. A third example here is the Walter Bauer view, which you've already talked about, which is that, oh, well, canon is just what happens when a bunch of people fight it out politically and theologically, and then when they win, someone gets to impose their books as opposed to someone else's books. It's all a human thing. No God involved. So what we can do as scholars, say the historical critical group, is just observe. Observe what happened historically and watch it unfold. Watch humans put together a human book. I give you a quote there in your notes. Hugo Lundhaug says this, I think he's a good representation of this model. Canonical status is not an intrinsic quality of a text, but a status bestowed upon it by a community of interpreters. In other words, there's nothing that's particularly special about these books. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't different than Thomas or Philip or any other gospel. It's just that these are the books that the theological winners picked and decided they would call them Scripture. So it's just a purely human enterprise front and back. So if that's what the historical critical model believes, what if you were to ask a historical critical guy, well, then how do you know which books belong in the canon? An historical critical scholar would say, okay, so you believe it's all just human naturalization, stick the microphone in your face. Well, how do you know which books belong there then? What would they say? They would say there is no belonging, right? That's the if you ask that question to a historical critical scholar, they're like, why are you asking me that question? That's the wrong question. The question isn't which books should be in the canon. That's an irrelevant question. Because once you say a book should be in and a book shouldn't be in, that implies there's some standard that they're not meeting. But it's all human. So for a historical critical scholar, if you ask him which books should be in the canon, he goes, there is no should, just which books are. So here's what a historical critical scholar will tell you. I can't tell you which books should be in the canon because there is no should. I can just tell you why certain books got there. Because this community pressured that community, or this political position won that political position, and so on. So here's what I want you to see about this. For the critical scholar, then, the issue isn't what should be in the canon, but what simply books are in the canon. What that means, then, is that for a critical scholar, he doesn't have to account for any metaphysical qualities about books, which books are right books or wrong books. For them, there's no right or wrong books, they're just the books. It's all just the work of humans. In fact, the real concern, if you read higher critical scholars who deal with canon, the real concern is not to declare which books are right, but to make sure that no one else declares which books are right. Their number one goal is to make sure no one talks about which books are right. Now, given their worldview for a moment, you can understand why that. If you really think the canon is just the result of humans doing what humans do in religion, then when someone trots along like us evangelicals and say, oh, by the way, these are the right books, can you imagine the hair on your, it's like they bristle. I don't know if you have a dog that bristles. I have a dog that bristles, right? I have a dog sits in my front yard, he's hanging out nice and quiet, nicest dog on the planet, and he sees another dog being walked outside the yard or outside on the street in front of a yard, and the hair on his neck sticks up. He starts that deep guttural growl, and he just bristles. You know, he's like, don't do that. Don't get near my house, right? Well, if you go to a critical scholar and you say, hey, these books are the right ones, they're going to bristle. They're going to like, oh, don't go there. There are no right books. Why are there no right books and wrong books? Because there's just books. How do we know there's just books? Because this is just what humans do in religion. They just create their own books. It's just it's the naturalization of canon, whether you attribute it to Marcion or self-exploration or Bauer. It doesn't matter what the micro theory is. The macro truth is just human activity doing what humans do. You can't attach any authority to anything like that, you evangelicals. Now, what you see here then, this is kind of a weird beginning, I know. The first example of the community-determined model then, the historical critical model, is sort of a non-model. You get that impression? It's not really a positive authentication of canon. It's more of a deconstruction of canon. So I know it's a rather odd place to begin. But the reason we begin here is because it is the same method. Canon is simply determined by human beings who get together in a community and pick books. And the books that are in are the books that humans picked, and that's just the way it is. And so, by the way, notice that, and I'm getting to this in my critique in a moment, notice how much theology is involved in an analysis. I believe in a God who doesn't reveal himself. I believe in a God who doesn't speak. And therefore, whatever books you think you got over there, you evangelicals, are not authoritative. Why? Because the evidence says so? No, but because I have a worldview that says that couldn't be. All right, let's talk about the critique. I'll try to offer some positive and negatives of each of these views. So I'm going to start with some positives here, or at least one. I could come up with one, and maybe you've got some others. What does this view get right about canon? It gets one thing right, positively, and that is it does recognize that the community of believers does play a role in which books become canon. It does play a role. Now, as soon as you say that, you realize there's a lot more to be said, right? Well, what kind of role? And this is where we're going to go in a little bit. We're not going to say it all here. But they're right. The canon does have an historical history in a community. To say it another way, what the historical critical view gets right is the canon didn't just drop from the sky on golden tablets, maybe produced by the angel Moroni if you're in the Mormon world. You know, all nice and tidy and neat and just, oh, look, there's the canon, all 27 books in golden sheets lowered down, all nice and tidy. No, God used a community to assemble it, put it together, and to recognize it over time. And if you believe in the canon and the way God delivered it, you're going to have to account for the role that community played. Now, does the historical critical view overinflate that role? In spades, right? But they are right that there's a role. And you'd be surprised to know that there's another view, when we get to the historically determined view, that almost pretends the church plays no role at all. Church? What church? All right, it's just purely data, historical data at that point. So we want to give them the nod they deserve here, and they're right about that. And you also have to say this. The historical critical model, as uncomfortable as it might be, exposes how messy the process was at times in the history of the canon. One thing I don't want you to hear from me in this class is that the canon we got settled on in the 4th century was this neat, tidy, perfect 400 years of development, and there was really no problems, and it was just, smooth as silk, and, nothing higher than a 1-foot wave on the ocean of the canon, etc. No, that's not true. It was not neat and tidy. There were challenges and troubles and tribulations along the way. We're going to talk about whether they're as big as the historical critical scholars say. We would disagree with that, but we think it wasn't neat and tidy. There were problems and challenges. So we got to give them another nod there on the positive side. They force us to look at that in a good way. But what about the negatives? Well, there's a ton here, and we're not going to say everything that can be said here. Our biggest complaint about this model is going to be a very similar complaint about the other examples of the the community-determined model. And that is the insistence that the church plays the definitive role in what books become canon. So there's a difference between saying the church plays a role versus the role. If the church is the absolute bedrock determining factor of what books are canonical, or people, whether you call it the church or not, human beings, that's different than saying that they play a role rather than the role. And this is where you're starting to already see similarities with Roman Catholicism here. But the other complaint is the big one. And that is the insistence on the naturalization of canon here. God has no role at all. There's no activity of the Spirit here. There's no activity of God here. There's no divine books here. It's just human beings putting together human books. This is where I said a moment ago, it's a rather odd place to start, I know, as far as canonical models, because this is sort of a non-model. It's not really trying to authenticate books. Every other model will try. This one's not really trying. This model is more like there are no authoritative books, so it's a rather non-model model. But nonetheless, their big view here that I would complain about and that we would disagree about is this idea that it's this purely human enterprise. Now, for the adherents to this historical critical worldview, this isn't a problem at all to say it's purely human. That's just kind of what they roll with in the academy. But we want to push back here, and here's one of the things we'd want to push back on. How do historical critical scholars actually establish that the canon is purely a human enterprise? They're convinced it is. But we want to ask a second question. How do they know it is? And once you ask that question, that actually raises an interesting conundrum for them. How do they know that it's just all human activity that produced these books and that there's no divine intervention? I suppose they could appeal to the level of human involvement in the canon throughout history. But we might respond and say, look, just the mere existence of human involvement doesn't preclude divine involvement. In fact, God often uses human involvement to accomplish his ends. Moreover, just the observation that human involvement is there does not mean it's sole human involvement. Two are not mutually exclusive, God's involvement and human involvement. What you end up discovering pretty quickly then is that the insistence that the canon is purely a human enterprise is actually not something that's derived from the facts of history. It's actually something that's brought to the examination of history. To put it yet another way, have you ever noticed how hierarchical scholars never actually try to prove the humanity of the canon, but just simply assume it? They don't actually show you, here's the 5 reasons why we demonstrate that it's only human activity that produced the canon and not divine. They could not do that. There's no way to do that. So what you realize is that the idea that canon is purely human is actually a default starting point. It's not something that you can demonstrate empirically. It's not something you can demonstrate historically. It's actually just where you begin. So we would ask, well, where does that come from? Where do you get the default starting point that the canon is purely a human enterprise if you can't show it empirically? The answer is it's in their canonical model. It's in their worldview. It's not historical. It's a theological belief they bring to the table. This is a little bit of what Ralph was getting at a moment ago when he talked about how a lot of hierarchical scholars, if they're not atheists or deists, meaning that look, God doesn't intervene in the world like that. We know that. So therefore, this idea that you have books from him is silly. It can't be. It's got to just be human books. But you notice they're starting with an assumption that's not itself coming from the historical facts. So there's 100 little other complaints I could bring against the historical critical model. In fact, half my book is on those. So I'm not going to review them all here because there's complaints about the handle of certain situations and historical evidences and so on. But my big complaints are, A, this idea that the church played the dominant role, which, as you can see, puts the church over the Bible rather than the Bible over the church. And then secondly, this idea that you can prove a human-only canonical process. You just can't show that. You can assume it. You can use it as a default starting point. And, of course, for hierarchical scholars, they're like, well, that's what the Enlightenment taught us. You assume everything without God unless you have to put him in, right? That kind of thing, which we think is a crazy place to go. Now, before we leave the historical critical model, which is the first example of the community-determined model, I want to talk about definition of canon for a moment. And I want to talk particularly about a newer definition of canon, new meaning the last 50 years plus, by a scholar by the name of A.C. Sundberg. Now, one thing we haven't talked about yet is what the word canon means. Let's talk about this for a second. There's 2 different ways to think about the word canon. First, there's what everyone always wants to talk about, is what you might call the etymology of a word, or the technical source or meaning of a word, versus the concept. So under etymology or technical meaning, what people typically talk about, oh, this is from the word canon in Greek, which is from, I can't remember what it is in Hebrew here. It might be canon. I can't remember. The point is, there's a word that canon comes from originally from Hebrew, but then in Greek, which means measuring line or standard or something like this. And so if you want to know what canon means, it's a word that means ultimate standard or measuring line or something. Okay, that's interesting. And I think you could do 100 word studies on canon, and a lot of that's been done. I find all that rather irrelevant. And here's why. The word canon is simply an English word that we use to describe a concept. And so trying to trace it back to the way it traces its way in English and Hebrew is a little bit misleading, because in the context of the Bible, the Greek isn't using it the way we're using it. We're using it for reference to books. They're not using it that way. So what I talk about the meaning of canon, we're talking about the concept of it. Okay, what does it refer to? This is what I think is really what matters. Now, here's what's curious. When people use the term canon, even on the concept level, they rarely define it. They rarely explain what it's referring to. Sundberg, who we're getting ready to talk about now, decided he would do that. And what did Sundberg say? He says you only have a canon when you have books on a fixed, final, closed list. That's a canon. Okay, fair enough. If I asked him where he got that definition from, I suppose he could say, well, I just made it up, meaning It's just the definition I like or I prefer. All right, someone's got to have the definition. We'll start there. If that's someone's definition of canon, fixed, final, and closed list, and someone were to date the canon, say, well, we have a canon on that definition. At X date, what date would we end up with? 400, maybe 500, or better put, probably 4th century, 5th century is probably a better way to say it, is when you ended up having a canon. Now, notice that you got a late date for canon almost 100% based on the definition you gave it. Okay? One of the things that I can't tell you that drives me so crazy when I see this is someone writes an article on the internet. Of course, that phrase right there could tell you a lot. Whenever someone writes an article on the internet, the stuff that gets said about the canon on the internet is just mind-bogglingly inaccurate. But I hear someone say, we don't have a canon until the 4th century. There was no canon until the 4th or 5th century, and this gets repeated ad infinitum all over the internet. What's often lurking behind that statement is that presupposes a certain definition of canon. Books on a fixed, final, closed list. And if one uses that definition, then that statement's correct. Given this definition, I'm going to challenge this definition in a moment, but given that definition, do books belong, or do you have a canon before the 4th century? No, of course, now you have a canon only in the 4th century or later if you go with that definition. But notice, the facts about canon haven't really changed, just the way you define it. One of the things that Sundberg's definition has done is change the debate in an unfortunate way, because it makes it sound like the date changed, when the date didn't change at all, but you just rephrase the definition, and suddenly it looks like the canon is a later phenomenon than it really is. So one of the things that Sundberg does then, when he defines canon like this, is he makes a sharp distinction between canon and Scripture. Now, you might think that canon and Scripture are the same thing, and I'm going to argue that most of the time they are. But notice what Sundberg does. He says they're not the same thing. You don't have a canon until you have a fixed, final, closed list of books. But you do have Scripture before that. Scripture just means books that are generally valued as, authoritative. You can have Scripture but not have a canon. So says Sundberg in his particular definition. I have all kinds of troubles with this, and I've written extensively on this, and not just here, but actually in my other book, The Question of Canon, which I'm not assigning for this class. You can read the first chapter of that book if you want a further rebuttal here. But let me just mention a few things about this definition that I object to, and then we'll take our break. First, if you're going to make a distinction between canon and Scripture, I wonder if the early Christians in, say, the 2nd century could have made this distinction. Sometimes when we use a concept and the concept doesn't fit what anyone was thinking about in the early church, you have to wonder if that concept's very helpful. If I were to go up to a Christian in the 2nd century and sort of say, hey, well, you have a Scripture, but you don't really have a canon, right? They'd be like, what are you talking about? Oh, well, what I mean is you have this amorphous collection of books that you call Scripture, but until you get a fixed, final, closed list, then you don't really have a canon. I mean, that concept would have been completely bizarre, because for them, as soon as you say one book in your library is Scripture, what do you have to say about another book in the library? That it's not Scripture. And as soon as you say one book is and one book isn't, you basically start to make demarcations between what's in and what's out. You basically have a canon. So the idea that this seems a little anachronistic for the 2nd century. The other thing I don't like about this definition is that it makes it sound like something radically changed in the 4th century. Like, well, all you had before the 4th century was Scripture, but now you finally have a canon, as if there's some big shift. It really isn't. As we'll see later in the class, even in the early 2nd century, there's already a huge amount of agreement on what we might call the core canon. So the idea that there was this big shift is just not there in the historical evidences. But there's a even more fundamental objection to this definition, and that is, what is a fixed, final, closed list? How much agreement is required to have a fixed, final, closed list? Does that mean you have to have 100% agreement across all of Christendom to have a fixed, final, closed list? Well, if that's the standard, you never have it. You don't have it now, even in the modern day. And so there's a little bit of ambiguity about what gets you on this list and how uniform this list has to be in order to count as a fixed, final, closed list. Here's what I want you to see, though, in sum about Sundberg's definition. If it's the definition we use, it'll end up giving us a 4th, 5th century date for canon, which is fine as long as we know that doesn't stem from the historical evidence. It just stems from the way we're using the term. And what I want you to see is that the way people are using the term is a little bit deceptive here, because it almost makes it sound like there's this big difference in the 4th century as opposed to the 3rd or even earlier. And I would say there actually wasn't that much difference between them.
preceding program has been brought to you by Reformed Theological Seminary and may not be reproduced or disseminated in part or in whole for sale or for profit without express written consent. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.